from Caracas is Christian Visnes. He's the regional director for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Colombia. Christian, good to have you on the program. How bad is the situation of people pouring across the border?
Well, it's becoming a large-scale crisis, clearly. UNHCR is reporting more than 2.3 million people that have now migrated throughout the region. And particularly in Colombia, this has a huge impact. Government of Colombia is reporting almost 1 million people now from Venezuela that have migrated. And these people are migrating to a country already in conflict. So this is a huge challenge and becoming a large-scale crisis.
Are they refugees or are they economic migrants?
People are fleeing from very difficult conditions. There is, of course, a discussion if what is their status. Most people that we talk to are fleeing from economical hardship of different the difficulty of accessing any kind of services in Venezuela is mainly what are pushing people to migrate throughout the region. Of course, it is important to also notice that Venezuela is now having one of the historically worst statistics when it comes to violence. So also many people talk about facing situations of crime. That is also an element when they decide to migrate throughout the region.
And what awaits them on the other side in Colombia? Are they getting enough help? What do they still need?
It's clear to us that the international community need to scale up the support for these people. These are people that have lived through difficult situations for years due to the economical hardship and have all kinds of needs and are coming to a country which is already struggling to support their own internal refugees, their IDPs. We in Colombia already work with thousands of people that have been internally displaced, and those are also struggling to get access to health, access to education. So it's clear that Colombia have a huge challenge and cannot do this by themselves.
There was a declaration in Quito where 11 nations committed to an integrated approach. Does that encourage you? What are we going to see happen on the ground that shows that coming into effect?
It is encouraging when people show, I think, solidarity. They also show that they understand that this is not a problem for one country. This is a regional challenge that needs to be solved together between countries, showing solidarity, showing support to people in need. So we are encouraged by the fact that countries keep their borders open. They allow people to cross borders and to seek better and help in different countries. It's clear, though, that more efforts, more resources, also from the reception countries, need to be put in place. But they also need a much stronger support. We are already working in different locations throughout the region, supporting people, but they need much more. And they also need to be included. They need to get regularized, to be able to find work and to integrate wherever they choose to go.
Okay, and one of the arguments, not only for this, but in a general sense, we've seen it with Palestinians who are displaced and elsewhere, is that if you make them too regular, if you allow them to take root in a place, then you lose the incentive to go back home. Is that something that needs to be taken into account?
For us, it's the situation of each individual. People are entitled to, they have human rights, they are entitled to have health services, to have a dignified life wherever they go. So that means that they need to be able to access health service. They need to get their children back to the school. We are, for example, helping people so that they can access education. Families and children that have been out of education for sometimes for 2 years. This is critical that they can rapidly access all kinds of social services, because if you don't, for example, in education, after 2 years, you're already losing your opportunity and you are creating a generation that have lost their opportunity for a proper education. So this is something you have to think about day by day. And it's a complex situation. We don't see any change in the situation in the short run. So I think what we need to think about is their situation today. And then we will have to and hope the nations can work together so they can be able to return, because I think that's what everybody wants. All Venezuelans wants to return and wants to live in dignity.
Okay, Christian Visnes, I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Well, to further the discussion, I'm joined now from Bogota by Senator and member of the Democratic Center Party, Paloma Valencia. Also in the Colombian capital is journalist Dylan Baddour, who's been covering the refugee crisis. And in Washington, D.C., we have Gimena Sanchez. She's a human rights advocate at the Washington office on Latin America, an advocacy organization advancing human rights in the Americas. Thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Dylan, let me begin with you. We heard from the Norwegian Refugee Council that the scale is, in a way, underestimated by the international community. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, very likely. It's hard to get precise numbers on the migration that's happening here. Because so much of it is undocumented and crossing an open border into Colombia. But it does seem like the world is steadily coming to recognize, how big of a crisis this is facing the region.
Paloma Valencia, Senator, can your government cope with the crisis right now? The foreign minister is saying that Colombia cannot deal with the situation alone. Is that a plea for help?
Yeah, absolutely. We need the help of the region. This is a problem that it's a concern from all the region and all the world. Colombia has a lot of troubles hanging all these Venezuelans who are welcome in the country, but it's a lot of burden for the Colombian government because, for example, talking about the health, the attention in the health system of Colombia is costing the government more than $250 million, which is a huge investment, and it is coming in a point of the economical crisis also in Colombia, because the last government left us a lot of debts.
And is it fair, because we just heard from the Norwegian Refugee Council, Christian Visnes there, is it fair from him to suggest, Senator, that it would be good for Colombia to make these economic migrants or refugees, whatever you want to call them, more regular, to allow them access to, or more access to healthcare, more access to schools, especially for the children? Yes, long term, we want the situation in Venezuela to get better and for them to go home, but for the moment, can Colombia do better to make them more regular? Is that fair?
We have to do it. I think this is a solidarity issue, and we have linked to the Venezuelan people that we will try to fulfill. But of course, we have a lot of difficulties in the fiscal situation of our country. That's why our president, Duque, is calling all the presidents of the region and all the nations in the world to see how delicate the situation is. We think there should be shares in all the countries of Latin America and Central America, so the Venezuelan people can go to different places and not only to Colombia. At this point, we're taking more or less 30% of the migrants, and that's a huge difficulty for the country. We're willing to help Venezuela, but we'll need the help of the other countries of the region.
Yeah, and that's going to be really interesting to see how that works, because most of them just cross the bridge, Simon Bolivar Bridge, and cross over, given the proximity. Gimena Sanchez, is Colombia doing all it can for these desperate people?
Well, I think that Colombia has expressed a lot of goodwill, and it should do that, given that over the past 50 years of conflict, Venezuela has received many Colombian refugees. However, I think that it doesn't have the full capacity to be able to meet such a huge challenge. A lot of the institutions along the border are very weak. In some departments, they've suffered through serious issues of corruption and mismanagement. And I also think that given the tremendous challenges it's facing just in implementing its own peace accord and addressing its own 7 million displaced people, that it really is going to need a tremendous amount of support from the international community and from international NGOs to meet the demands that these Venezuelans are bringing in.
Dylan Baddour, what do you suggest the Colombians do in order to better help these people?
Well, the big challenge here is definitely documentation, regularizing many of the migrants, which Colombia did a pretty good. They've made a pretty solid effort. In the last months, they did a census registering, I think more than 40,000 undocumented Venezuelans in the country. And this, the fact that many come without a passport or any type of official documentation poses big problems, registering them for school and such things as that. And it's really a challenge to get documentation for people who arrive and have none. But I do agree with what Gimena says, that the country is really pressed here, and it's certainly not, wealth is not overflowing here to deal with a situation like this. And so as far as services like health and education, the country won't reasonably be able to just provide unlimited services to a million, or very likely many more than that, people just coming into the country.
Okay, so Paloma, I want you to sink your teeth now into the politics here. You might have heard what the Vice President of Venezuela said, Delcy Rodriguez. This is a quote. Individual officials, this was to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, by the way. Individual officials have been portraying a normal migratory flow from Venezuela to Colombia as a humanitarian crisis to justify an intervention. That's how they see it in the corridors of power in Caracas. Your response to that is what?
Well, you cannot try to understand what the regime is thinking, because every time something very bad is happening in Venezuela, they have a very weird answer for what's happening. I think they know that they are failing, that they fail absolutely, and that Nicolás Maduro is a dictator that is turning over all the rights of the Venezuelan people. And now they're trying to keep a speech about how everybody's against them, and that's why they're failing. But they're failing because they chose a bad politician, a bad policies for the Venezuelan people. So what I think is that the international organizations should act against Venezuelan regime and should push an election, but a real election in Venezuela, so that we can have really this regime gone, and we have a free government that will try to rebuild Venezuela.
Gimena, is there a kernel of truth in what the Vice President said, or are the Venezuelan leadership just in denial about the actual crisis that's happening in their country and forcing their people into becoming refugees?
I think that Venezuela needs to own up to the fact that they've generated a tremendous humanitarian crisis that's led to chronic malnutrition, has led to people not having their money be worth anything, so that they're forced to flee across the borders. And I think that they need to work on figuring out some kind of solution to the problem. We think that that solution should be a politically negotiated solution. The history of military intervention and coups throughout Latin America and the history is really not the way to go. However, I think denying the problem is just not going to go away. They need to accept humanitarian assistance within their country, and the international communities to figure out an integrated approach that really is an operationalized shared responsibility among countries. Colombia cannot take on the full burden of this. And it's not only reaching Colombia, it's reaching many other countries in the region, including Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and other areas. So I totally disagree with that statement.
Mm-hmm. Dylan, is there denialism from the Venezuelans, and is that denialism making it worse?
Yeah, it's hard to say what's making it worse, because the situation's just kind of spiraling out of control. But it's definitely an illegitimate denial. I mean, I work a lot from the border there, seeing thousands of people cross every day. And, the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro, says things like the Venezuelans who are leaving with $5,000 in their pockets. which is absolutely not true. And it certainly does not help the situation that Venezuela is entirely unable to collaborate. You know, for example, the Colombian Migration Authority, they've told me that it's been several years, perhaps 2 or 3 years, since they've had any collaborative communication with Venezuela's Migration Authority, because Venezuela insists that this news of a massive exodus is fabricated, you know, as part of the imperialist conspiracy. So definitely, the people charged with helping this situation do not expect to look to Venezuela, to Venezuelan authorities for any sort of aid or help or collaboration in dealing with this.
And Dylan, from the people you spoke to on the border as they stream across, what do they tell you? I mean, do they have political views about what's going on back home? Or are they merely telling you, listen, I can't feed my kids anymore. I need to go to a place that's better for that to happen. What are they talking about? Is it more hand to mouth? Is it ideological? Is it political? What is it?
There are plenty of people coming across the border who voted for the late Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez in his day. And that, you know, there's been a change of heart on that front. People say it takes a solid month of work to earn enough money to buy a big bag of rice or a big bag of flour. And, you know, most people are leaving with the hope of going abroad and making money to support their families back home. Of course, there's pretty much unanimous support to remove President Nicolas Maduro from power. But really no conceivable means of doing that at the moment, and no opposition organized in a strong enough fashion to do that. So many people think their only hope is to leave, simply to make enough money for them to eat and to send money home to their families. And, you know, just coming across the border in Colombia, they say, here you can work for a day and make the equivalent of about $3 US, which is 10,000 Colombian pesos. Send it home, and that's enough to eat for 2 weeks. So it's hard to dissuade them from this migration.
Paloma, do you feel that the world has ignored this crisis and that you're shouldering the burden while nobody really cares about it, or they have their priorities elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. This crisis has been growing all over these past years, and we have been, from our party, denouncing the abuses of the regime against the Venezuelan people. But if you see the OEA and all the international organizations were unwilling to vote against the government of Venezuela. Even our president, Juan Manuel Santos, denied the vote against Venezuela because there are serious issues in Venezuela happening from a long time, and everybody was trying to not look at it. And now we're dealing with a huge crisis, a tragedy, you may say, because all these people are coming here without any food, without any perspective of the future, with children. And this country, which is willing to take them in, don't have the resources to do it in the way it should be done.
And Gimena, looking at the politics again and the context that is created by the Venezuelan government when they see themselves under siege, particularly from the West. It doesn't really help, does it, when we have the New York Times, for example, come out with a report that shows that Trump administration officials were meeting with disgruntled Venezuelan military officers to discuss a coup plot and stuff. It doesn't help those people who are fleeing for a better life, because it just makes the government double down, doesn't it?
Well, yes, but the important thing about that New York report to note is that they met, but they didn't agree with taking military intervention. And so in Washington, our officials tend to meet with many different people and many different voices to get an understanding of what's going on. That doesn't mean that there was definitely a plan on the part of the U.S. at least. Yes, those sorts of situations don't help because especially stuff done by the Venezuelan opposition or other groups that are trying to change the government in a forceful way only become, fodder for Maduro to, stick his heels in and not address the real problems that he has in front of him, which is a severe financial crisis, a severe humanitarian situation, and a completely unsustainable situation that is continuing to implode.
And I'm going to circle back to the very beginning, to the question that I asked the member of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Paloma Valencia, are these people economic migrants or are they refugees?
I don't know if you can distinguish between both of the situations. There are people who are going out of their country because they don't have any future and any options. Nobody goes out of their country if they have options to stay there. So what we're facing here, even if it's an economic crisis or refugees, it's a humanitarian crisis. I will say it needs that all the world turns their eyes to Venezuela and Colombia and help these people who really need help.
Yeah, that's right. More than 2.5 million people, according to some estimates, have left Venezuela in search of a better life. It's not great for them, and it's a growing and brewing crisis. We'll be keeping a close eye on the situation, especially on the border between Venezuela and Colombia. For the moment, I have to thank all of you because I have to move on. Paloma Valencia, Baddour, and Gimena Sanchez, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.